The 17th morning of the federal trial against Sean P. Diddy Combs began like any other reporters stationed outside the courthouse sexual violence victim advocates, holding signs high and curious passers-by, snapping pictures of the crowd. But the air seemed to freeze for a moment when a black SUV pulled up in front of the main entrance. The door opened, and out stepped a man no one expected to see there, George Clooney. There was no red carpet, no cheering fans, no greetings from admirers, only the flash of cameras, the click of a door from security, and puzzled stares. Clooney, long seen as the epitome of Hollywood elegance, a human rights advocate, the director who exposed the atrocities in Darfur, wasn't there to receive an award. He was there to take the oath. He wore a simple gray suit, no tie. He walked with calm determination. His face was unreadable, his gaze fixed straight on the federal judge. This wasn't a role. There was no script, no director. And no one in the courtroom, neither side's attorneys, knew what Clooney was about to say. George Clooney had not been mentioned in any pre-trial documents. His name wasn't on the official witness list. His presence was not just unexpected, it was seismic. No one imagined Clooney, the archetype of public decency, had any connection to the parties described as brutal and perverse, where victims claimed they were raped, drugged, and filmed without consent. Why was George Clooney here? No one could immediately answer. Even the judge hesitated before nodding to allow him to testify. Clooney had no known ties to Diddy. They weren't part of the same music world nor cultural generation. They were rarely photographed together, if ever. And yet Clooney began to speak, and the room jurors, prosecutors, reporters, and victims' families fell completely silent. "I'm not part of his world," Clooney began, his voice deep and clear. "I don't know what happens in his private life, but I was once present at a party, and I saw something that made silence impossible. A gut punch. A blow to the public fantasy that good people and bad people exist in neat categories between what is performed and what is concealed." George Clooney spoke of a night in August 2016 at a mansion in Bel-Air. He had been invited to what the invitation called an internal fundraiser for community programs. The event included celebrities, politicians, and major donors. But around 1 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. "I was planning to leave. I didn't belong there," he said. "But then I saw a girl maybe 20 years old being pulled into a back room. She didn't scream, but her eyes, they were screaming for help. And no one saw it." Diddy's lawyer stood and objected. The judge overruled it. "I've worked in South Sudan. I've seen the eyes of people held in slavery." Clooney said, his voice no longer calm. "And I saw that same look there, right in the heart of Bel-Air. A witness, a symbol, and a moment that Hollywood could not ignore. George Clooney didn't come out of friendship. He didn't know Diddy well enough to defend or condemn him. He came to testify for what he had seen, for a nameless girl, for a look he couldn't forget, and maybe for the question that lingered in the courtroom that day. If even George Clooney needed 8 years to speak up, how many others are still silent? Sean P. Diddy Combs, long synonymous with the pinnacle of American hip-hop culture, was never just an artist. He was a brand, an empire. Music, fashion, vodka, reality television, and more recently social media ventures all sat within his sphere of influence. With a fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions, Forbes had repeatedly named him among the wealthiest and most powerful artists in the world. But when the light turned to what lay behind the stage, where deals were inked in the shadows, calls left no record, and midnight parties were held that no one dared to name, the empire began to crack. The whispers that once circulated backstage were now sworn testimony. And if these testimonies were true, Sean Combs wasn't merely a cultural icon. He was the architect of a system of exploitation shielded by fame, fortune, and silence. The first to break that silence was Cassie Ventura, singer-model and Combs's ex-girlfriend of nearly a decade. In a civil suit filed in November 2023 and withdrawn just 24 hours later following a confidential settlement, Cassie detailed years of abuse, rape, forced group sex, financial control, and electronic surveillance. Cassie alleged that Diddy called his freak-offs a form of creative therapy sessions in which she was forced to have sex with strangers, sometimes members of his own crew, under his direct supervision. She wasn't allowed to refuse. Hidden cameras were placed throughout. Resistance brought punishment, salary cuts, threats against loved ones, or worse, violence. Diddy, like many master manipulators, didn't just use fists. He used promises, praise, the invisible pull of power to unmoor his victims from their own reality. Cassie once believed she was being loved. It took her years to realize she was being controlled. The second witness, known under the alias Mia, had served as Diddy's personal assistant for years. Her testimony, protected under federal anonymity law, was a detailed map of how a man with fame could construct a private universe where law stopped at the door and defiance meant mortal risk. Mia testified that Diddy once held a gun to her head simply because she failed to report Cassie's relationship with singer Kid Cudi fast enough. She was subjected to marathon lie detector tests in windowless rooms, interrogated by hired specialists. Her passport was confiscated during overseas trips. Any sign of resistance, even tears, was treated as betrayal. Messages shown by Diddy's legal team in which Mia sent birthday wishes or said "I miss you" were presented as evidence against her. But psychologists identified them as classic signs of coercive control syndrome when victims maintain emotional ties to their abuser because they feel they have no other choice. "The more I loved him," Mia testified, "the safer I felt." The trial also made clear Diddy didn't act alone. From drivers and bodyguards to hotel staff and flight attendants, many had knowingly or not become links in the chain. Some were granted immunity in exchange for testimony. They spoke of being paid well to look away, to not ask, not notice, and most of all, not remember. George Kaplan, a former close aide, testified he once saw Diddy hurl an apple at a woman named Gina in a fit of rage. Gina was identified as victim number 3 in the indictment. Though she had yet to appear in court, her story resurfaced again and again. In a 2019 video, she described being kicked in the stomach by Diddy, coerced into 2 abortions, and threatened into silence. The parties once hailed as Hollywood's most exclusive gatherings were redrawn in a darker hue penthouses rented under shell corporations, guests signing NDAs, phones confiscated, and security hired through obscure firms. According to a former aide, Diddy always had the full picture: who came, who left, who drank what, who slept with whom. Another witness, identified only as Jane Doe, testified that she was flown on a private jet to St. Bart's, believing she was there to shoot a music video. In reality, she was held for 3 days without a phone, forced into sex, and recorded. Why was George Clooney the one to break the silence? The answer began on a summer night in 2016 in Bel-Air, a neighborhood of mansions west of Los Angeles. Clooney had been invited to a charity fundraiser hosted by a well-known producer. The guest list was special: a few A-listers, some political operatives, and as he was told, people you'll never see in magazines but who are at every power table. Clooney is not easily shaken, but he recalled a chill-down-the-spine moment when he sensed something was off. "When you've worked in places like Congo, Sudan, or Lebanon," he said on the stand, "you learn to sense when people are being controlled. The coldness doesn't come from the air conditioning. It comes from fear." Clooney said he was about to leave early, but was stopped by someone who wanted to pitch a collaboration project. Walking into a side room, he happened to see a young girl being pulled down a narrow hallway by 2 men in black suits. She didn't scream, but when she turned back, he saw it, a cry for help buried in her eyes, and it haunted him for years. He didn't know who she was. He didn't see what happened next. But 7 years later, when he read Cassie Ventura's complaint, and especially after a recording by Twitch, the beloved choreographer who died by suicide in 2022 was played in court, he knew he could no longer stay silent. "We are responsible for what we see," Clooney told the jury. even if it's just for a moment, even without hard proof. Because truth always begins with the smallest thing, a look we choose to forget. In the final minutes of his testimony, Clooney didn't call Diddy a criminal. He didn't condemn anyone by name. But he left the courtroom with one question. If someone like me with fame, influence, and safety feels afraid to speak, then what will those with nothing do? That question and the girl's eyes from that long-ago night continued to haunt the room, and perhaps the entire industry. Inside Courtroom 7C of the Manhattan Federal Court Day 17 of Sean P. Diddy Combs's trial had already taken an extraordinary turn, not just because George Clooney appeared, but because his testimony seemed to rupture the very air in the room. Not an explosion, but a crack, slow, deliberate, and irreversible in the architecture of silence that Combs and his inner circle had constructed over 2 decades. Clooney stepped onto the witness stand amid a hush so complete it bordered on reverence. No camera shutters, no courtroom murmurs. Even the most high-profile attorneys, Brian Steele, known for defending Young Thug, and U.S. Attorney Maureen Comey, paused their note-taking. "I don't know her name," Clooney began, "but I know that look. I worked in Sudan, in Congo. I know the look of someone trapped in sexual slavery." And that was the look. The words struck the courtroom like a stone tossed into a lake that had remained still for too long. Cassie's lawsuit, the assistant's testimonies, even the video footage and hotel invoices, those were legal matters. But Clooney's words, spoken by a man with no stake, no pending lawsuit, no direct connection, transformed suspicion into visceral, undeniable presence. Diddy's lawyers immediately objected, asking that Clooney's statement be stricken due to its emotional nature and lack of corroborating evidence. The judge disagreed. "This witness is not alleging a crime," the judge said. "He is describing a personal observation at a private event. The jury will determine its weight." When asked why he hadn't spoken out sooner, Clooney didn't flinch. "I was afraid, not for myself. I know my position in this system as a famous white man with influence. But I also knew that if I spoke without concrete proof, I wouldn't just hurt one person, I'd be disrupting an entire network of power that protects itself. And when that system falls, who protects the people trapped within it?" Clooney's testimony peeled back shadows that earlier witnesses had only hinted at. He described the atmosphere at these parties: booming music, strong liquor lights shifting endlessly, and most crucially, an invisible layer of control. Phones were taken at the door, he said. No staff wore company badges. Security were large men, silent, expressionless. They came from a firm that to this day I haven't been able to find any public record of. One of the most jarring details Clooney emphasized was the culture of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, handed out at the door requiring handwritten signatures, no copies, and no permissions to take them home. NDAs aren't unusual in Hollywood, but according to Clooney, the severity and enforcement at Diddy's events were unlike anything I'd ever seen. "I've been to fundraisers, award galas, closed-door events, but I've never signed an NDA that felt like I was entering a classified military zone," he said. And what's more frightening, people accepted it so easily. He recounted asking another guest, a well-known actress, about it. She merely shook her head and gave a dry smile. "Everyone knows, but no one talks. If you want to work in this town, don't ask too many questions." Yet the moment that left the courtroom breathless was Clooney's recollection of a conversation with Diddy himself at that same 2016 Bel-Air party. He came up to me, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said something I've never forgotten. "You know, George, everyone has something I want, and I always find a way to make them give it to me." According to Clooney, it wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a joke either. He described Diddy as someone who read people like scripts, understood exactly how much power he held, and used intimacy like a tool. He never ordered. He suggested. He implied. He made you think you wanted it. That's power without force, and sometimes it's even more frightening. In another instance, Clooney recalled hearing Diddy tell a young director, "I can get you on the cover of GQ next month." or I can make sure you never get a contract again. Your call." Then came the statement that led the prosecutor to request it be entered into the court record. I heard him brag that he controlled the stars, had campaign donors in D.C. on speed dial, and that, with one phone call, everything could disappear. Brian Steele Diddy's lead counsel launched a furious objection. The witness is making indirect criminal insinuations with no material evidence, no corroborating testimony, and entirely subjective interpretations. But the prosecution countered immediately. This witness is not accusing. He is describing what he saw, heard, and experienced. The jury has the right to evaluate his credibility. The judge allowed the testimony to proceed. There was one thing no one could deny: Clooney had no personal motive. He wasn't tied to music projects. He had no business ventures with Diddy. He wasn't part of any pending civil action. That made his testimony all the more significant and more dangerous to the system it exposed. A juror asked by a reporter after court that day whether Clooney had influenced their thinking responded simply, "He didn't need to convince me. I just needed to hear him speak." The trial moved forward. But after day 17, no one could call this a personal case anymore. Because when a witness with nothing to gain, like George Clooney, takes the stand and confirms the existence of a manipulation ecosystem, the question was no longer, did Diddy commit crimes, but who allowed this to go on for so long? Clooney's testimony wasn't the climax. It was the spark, the fuse, the trigger of a cascade that even Diddy's elite legal team couldn't contain, not after day 17. What Clooney described, the eyes pleading for help, the shadowy NDAs, the dimly lit rooms, was no longer just memory or emotion. It eerily aligned with new digital evidence introduced shortly after his testimony: audio recordings made by Stephen "Twitch" Boss, the renowned choreographer and longtime DJ of the Ellen DeGeneres Show, who reportedly died by suicide in December 2022. In court, the recording played to near total silence. Twitch's voice, hoarse, trembling, yet unmistakably clear, filled the room. "I don't believe this is the real world. Diddy told me, just smile, everyone here is safe." But no one was safe. A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom. A few people exchanged glances, visibly shaken. The image of a young black man, famous for his dazzling smile and infectious energy, now emerged only through sound, like a ghost haunted by something he couldn't say while alive. The recording was stored on an old external hard drive turned over to the FBI by Twitch's wife, Allison Holker, who discovered it on a laptop he used during tours. The full recording lasted over 12 minutes, disjointed, scattered, but orbiting one terrifying theme: secret parties, disturbing behaviors, and the fear of being killed for speaking out. In another segment, Twitch said, "At first I thought it was just rich people doing rich people stuff. But then I saw girls being dragged into rooms and not coming back out for hours." Ellen called it the creative zone. But it wasn't creativity. It was where you lost yourself. The name Ellen DeGeneres surfaced like a fracture line through the moral facade she had built over decades. The same woman, once honored for championing equality, awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama, was now referenced in a federal investigation involving trafficking and organized sexual abuse. According to records presented by prosecutors, one party mentioned in the recording took place in late July 2019 at the Viceroy Hotel in Santa Monica. Hotel booking logs showed a penthouse suite on the 12th floor, rented under the name Frank Black, a known alias Diddy had used in previous business transactions. Of note, Ellen DeGeneres had landed that same day at Van Nuys Private Airport, a mere 20-minute drive away based on aircraft itinerary data from a charter management firm. From hotel surveillance footage restored from backup archives at the prosecution's request, Twitch is seen entering the elevator at 11:42 p.m. with a group of 6 people. 2 hours later, hallway cameras captured him exiting alone, shirt-torn, stumbling, bracing himself against the wall. There is no further footage of him that night. When the recording ended, the lead prosecutor stood and addressed the court. We are not formally alleging that Stephen Boss's death was a homicide, but we do believe his final words were a warning, a last will for what was happening at the highest levels of entertainment. Diddy remained motionless during the audio playback, upright, expressionless, but his legal team immediately moved to have the recordings excluded, citing lack of authentication. The FBI, however, confirmed the file's integrity, unedited status, and a creation date matching Twitch's laptop usage logs. Ellen DeGeneres was subsequently subpoenaed to clarify her role in a series of private events co-hosted with Diddy between 2016 and 2021. By day 18 of the trial, a temporary arrest warrant had been signed, naming Ellen Lee DeGeneres. No one in that courtroom could have imagined it would go this far. But as the list of witnesses, potential defendants, and connected parties grew, artists, directors, donors, even retired judges, it became clear this wasn't just Diddy's trial. This was a reckoning for an entire system. In the days that followed, the court heard from a slew of unexpected figures, a former White House media aide, an Emmy-winning actress, and a senior executive from Spotify. Each added new confirmation to the picture. Clooney had introduced an ecosystem where fame was a weapon power, a shield, and silence the most valuable currency. According to lead federal prosecutor Mimi Roger, the most terrifying truth wasn't in any single act, but in how those acts were organized, protected, and legitimized. We have evidence that at least 3 major law firms helped Diddy and his associates quietly settle over 18 abuse-related complaints, 4 involving minors, she stated. All of them were sealed through civil agreements. No one was criminally charged. An internal email retrieved from a hacked media server revealed a senior attorney had once written, "What we're protecting isn't the client. It's the business model of this industry." In a previously aired interview, Ellen DeGeneres once said, "Be kind. You never know what someone's going through." Today, those words echoed like bitter irony. Because if the courtroom testimony is true, then those on the other side weren't just going through something, they were living in a nightmare, one celebrated by media, shielded by icons, and silenced by institutions once thought to be paragons of moral leadership. The trial of Sean P. Diddy Combs had now evolved beyond the confines of criminal proceedings. It became a mirror held up to the American entertainment complex and the illusions we have long upheld about our cultural idols. As witnesses stepped forward, as footage surfaced, as hotel documents and digital files refused to vanish, an entire ecosystem that had operated on blind admiration was now being forced to confront its own reflection. Diddy may not be the first accused, and he won't be the last. But what makes this case different is the infrastructure not just built with wealth, but with culture. For years, Diddy represented the black success dream, a man who rose from Harlem to billionaire status, built record labels, launched Ciroc vodka, and stood shoulder to shoulder with presidents from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama. The image was meticulously crafted, a successful black man using his platform to uplift the community, an Obama of pop culture. And that is precisely why, when the allegations emerged of sexual abuse, trafficking threats, and psychological manipulation, many didn't want to believe, not out of naivete, but because they needed the symbol, needed the proof that a black man can succeed and still be good. But the truth is colorblind. Cassie Mia Twitch and other witnesses didn't speak out for money. They knew the cost, career ruin, safety threats, community backlash. And still, they chose to testify. Because if a symbol must be upheld by the silence of the powerless, then that symbol deserves to fall. At a critical point during the trial, when the air in the courtroom had thickened with testimony recordings and the haunted stares of a subdued jury, the lead prosecutor rose. Her voice was firm but never theatrical. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. This is not just a verdict for one man. This is a wake-up call for an entire system where a handshake, a rap verse, and a ballot can erase all wrongdoing. It was a line destined to be quoted in journalism, classrooms, ethics, seminars, and future campaigns for industry reform. Because the truth was this: the trial of Sean P. Diddy Combs was never just a criminal indictment. It had become a mirror reflecting the shadow architecture of American cultural power, where fame, charisma, and artistic legacy often outweigh human dignity and truth. George Clooney, who didn't need to appear, didn't need to speak, had nothing to prove, ended his testimony with a sentence the courtroom may never forget. Power doesn't come from fame. It comes from the choice to tell the truth even when you stand alone. That sentence wasn't just the conclusion of a witness. It was a warning that in a world built on applause, silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity. Following Clooney's testimony, a wave of others reached out to the FBI to offer cooperation. Among them, a young director, a well-known entertainment journalist, and a former employee of Bad Boy Records Diddy's label. People who had once been afraid, who once thought no one would believe me, began to speak. On social media, a new undercurrent began to rise. Artists who collaborated with Diddy in the 2000s began scrubbing old photos, canceling joint projects, or posting cryptic yet telling messages. The culture of exposing power, once dismissed as a trend during the Me Too era, was entering a new phase, one where the accused were no longer aging producers in the shadows, but mega celebrities. And that's what made the industry tremble. One media strategist wrote, "Fame isn't truth. Fame is the story repeated so many times that people stop asking questions." The Diddy trial reversed that logic. It forced America to ask, are we believing stories because they're true or because we're too afraid to question what's hidden? The witnesses weren't perfect. They had complicated pasts. Some had sent affectionate messages to the very man they accused. But that is the anatomy of coercion. It is not a straight line between victim and perpetrator. It is a psychological labyrinth where the powerless are taught that to speak up is to be destroyed. But they spoke anyway. And one more truth, Diddy didn't create the system. He learned how to exploit it. The system had always been there, where silence was chosen for career market community or simply because everyone else was doing it. For over 2 decades, the American entertainment industry portrayed itself as a beacon of liberation, creative freedom, equal opportunity, diversity celebrated. But behind the curtain, another culture coexisted, one of domination, where the powerful controlled bodies, voices, and reputations with impunity. George Clooney may not have been the key legal witness, but he was the moral one. His presence forced the jury and the public to confront a question that no statute could answer. Who do we trust when there's no one left to trust? The trial will continue. A formal verdict, if any, will come next month. But the true ending of this story doesn't lie in the courtroom. It lies in Hollywood. It lies in the awards shows that once clapped for the accused, in the record labels that buried lawsuits under out-of-court settlements, in the tech platforms that throttled negative press but promoted music videos glorifying abusers, and in every audience member who once loved, once shared, once defended those icons because they believed or needed to believe that such people couldn't do wrong. Because the real source of power was never violence. It was consent, even if that consent came in silence. And if Clooney was right, then the turning point on day 17 wasn't about testimony. It was about the moment someone inside the system finally stood up and said, "I saw." And I can't ignore it. This story isn't over. But America, the entertainment industry, and each of us as spectators can no longer say we didn't know.